What is the most moral movie ever made? Well, to answer that question, one important figure to look to might be the movie's hero. The hero's journey, as popularized by figures like Joseph Campbell, is a contentious topic in cultural studies. I don't think the concept itself is what raises issues, only the idea of it being a universal in all cultures, or in all stories from all cultures. Regardless of what Campbell's intentions were, it's hard to deny the startling parallels which sometimes exist between one story and another, especially when some of these stories originate in cultures as distant from one another as entire continents. There are a ton of great films which utilize this very structure, many of them almost archetypal in that regard. But for me, my personal favorite, and the one that subverts the norms most cleverly, is Abbas Kiarostami's classic, Where is the Friend's House? Unlike other films, like Star Wars, The Lord of the Rings, or Harry Potter, which turn this concept up to 11, Where is the Friend's House elevates its subject matter by making it feel so quaint. Very little is at stake here, the worst consequence being one student's expulsion from school. Likewise, the literal journey being taken in the film is a small one, with most of the film's runtime being made up of our main character, Ahmad, trying to find the house of his classmate. A task which is only so hard because most people seem indifferent to his quest. This indifference, this inability of most to see the gravity of the situation, ties into one of the main themes of the film, the rusty moral compass of the adult world. Unlike more fantastical forms of fiction, where the obstacle of the protagonist takes on the form of either stereotypical evil or stereotypical beastliness, the closest thing we have to villainous evil here is the indifference of adults, most of whom are so jaded and warped by their daily lives, the chores and commerce which keep their world stable, that an act of kindness being done for the sake of saving another from injustice doesn't even seem to register to them as something important at all. The movie is great at establishing this divide between child and adult, doing so in a way that's reminiscent of Spielberg's E.T. But where that film uses this divide to exemplify the loss of imagination and wonder that happens in adulthood, Where is the Friend's House keeps its focus squarely on motivation. The corruption, in quotes, of the adult characters comes from the fact that they live in a world of responsibility. They are the world as it exists after Adam and Eve were cast out of Eden for eating from the tree of knowledge. They're doomed to live a life scraping together their existence through acts which are rote, repetitive, and mundane. Ahmad's morality then comes from the fact that the world has yet to lose its Eden-like luster for him. He sees his responsibilities, fulfills them, but also acknowledges them as secondary to that which is more important, the righting of cosmic wrongs. In order to accomplish his task, he has to maneuver through a world specifically built to minimize his input. This hierarchy of authority, while likely well-meaning at first and almost definitely necessary, eventually becomes solidified in place and is then unyielding to novel moral predicaments. Ahmad, being young and seeing the world with fresher eyes, is capable of cutting duty down to its barest essentials, that is, do things which make the world better. Everything else, including his own responsibilities, only exist for this reason anyway. At the very least, they exist to minimize the bad in the world. Ahmad, by foregoing the will of the authority figures around him, is instead listening to a higher moral authority. This is true whether you're talking about the authority of God or the more secular authority of the abstract good discussed and argued about in philosophy. The Herculean nature of his task, while almost seeming like lighthearted satire at first, begins to be reflected by the film's tone and visuals as it goes along. The transitioning from day into night brings with it a sense of dreaminess, almost a sense of the mystical. The night streets, through becoming deserted, become almost a chamber of self-reflection for the soul. The orange light in the home windows, a visual going back to the poetry and prose of ancient times, conjures up this sense of profundity, which is inherent in life, but which goes mostly unnoticed. The movie makes it here relatively naturally. After all, the day and the day's duties with it end at night. But it's Kiarostami's genius to accentuate the night itself which really gives this movie its dynamic range. It's really impressive considering how short, quaint, and simple the film is. The compromise made at the end of the film, when Ahmad's mission to find his classmate technically fails, becomes the highlight, often cited as one of the great tear-jerking moments in film. The good job scribbled on the paper hits hard because we know, even if the teacher doesn't, that the person he's congratulating isn't who he thinks he is. Like the other adults in the film, he fails to see the secret moral life happening right under his nose. But in this case, for the first time in the movie, an adult's failure to understand is for the best. Luckily, we, as adults, got to see what he didn't, and we're all the more richer for it.